Hello and welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is Matt.
And my name is James.
And this week on the show, true to form, as we did in our first and second series, we're going back to the greatest science fiction franchise of all time. We're having a look at how time travel works in Star Trek. James, you excited to look at some time travel stories in Star Trek episodes?
Yes, definitely. As always with these episodes, I'm letting you be my guide into the Star Trek universe. So you've handpicked several different episodes across lots of different series. And yeah, we're going to sort of delve into the time travelness in Star Trek.
Yeah, so the first one we're going to be looking at is Season 1, Episode 28 of the original series of Star Trek, The City on the Edge of Forever. And then we've got a two-parter from DS9, Season 3, Episodes 11 and 12, Past Tense, Parts 1 and 2. And then we're going to round things off with a little bit of fun with Deep Space Nine's Season 5, Episode 6, Trials and Tribulations. And of course, the original Tribbles episode will feature into that conversation as well. But let's get started with The City on the Edge of Forever.
Behold, a gateway to your own past, if you wish.
So James, this is from the first season of Star Trek. It's one of the last few episodes in that season. I don't think it's the season finale, but it is considered to be one of the very best episodes in any series of Star Trek. So had you seen this one before? And what did you think of it?
I had not seen this one before. I've got to be honest, I haven't seen many from the actual original series of Star Trek. So it was nice this time round getting to visit that as well. And sort of like get in with the nostalgia of it, and just sort of like, even the way it looks, all the Technicolor sort of like filming, I love looking at stuff like that because it has this real sort of like old feel, but it's like a nice warm sort of color palette they've got in there.
Yeah, it does look nice, doesn't it? And you would have seen the remastered version, which I watched as well, which is what's available on Netflix. Where the ships look really good. I wonder if the ships look a bit too good because they're kind of CGI and it looks nice, but it stands out from some of the rest of it.
Yeah, that did take me by surprise when they sort of like put in the CGI bits, because I had to double take it. I was like, what is this? Is this really from that time period? What's going on?
Yeah, a little bit of time travel in the production there. Cheating their way to better looking ships. But this episode's written by Harlan Ellison, and we talked about his work, I think, in series 1 when we were looking at AI, because we would have talked about his amazing short story, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Do you remember him from our conversation?
Yeah, I remember reading that short story as well, because you sent it over to me as well. I don't know if it was before or after the podcast episode, but I had a read of that, and that story in particular was really bleak. It was like, it's very full on, his work. And if any of his other stuff's like on the same level as that, I can see he's got a certain tone that he brings to his science fiction stories. Yeah,
he likes a certain amount of darkness and grimness, I think. I've only read and experienced a limited amount of his stuff, but yeah, it's definitely there. I can't remember if I mentioned this to you on the podcast when we talked about AI and Harlan Ellison, but Harlan Ellison had a major feud with Gene Roddenberry and the Star Trek franchise as a whole. But what I didn't realize until I was doing some reading up for this episode was that this episode, The City on the Edge of Forever, is his first and only credit on Star Trek, and it was the experience of working on this episode that led to that rift between him and the Star Trek franchise. So I don't quite know the details, but he was not on speaking terms, I don't think, with Gene Roddenberry for the rest of either one, whoever died first, the rest of their lives.
God, that's really full on, because it is such a great episode and I really, really enjoyed watching it. But yeah, it's weird that sort of like ended their relationship.
Yeah, I think it might be to do with creative control and things like that, because Harlan Ellison, for all of his dark, grim sci-fi genius, I get the impression he's a bit of a bastard to work with, a bit of a cantankerous bugger, I guess, to try and put it nicely. I don't know if he's like the easiest guy to work collaboratively with, and I think that's what drove the problems. And I think that rift is also why Harlan Ellison is credited as something like creative consultant on every single episode of Babylon 5. Again, we talked about the kind of the issues between Babylon 5 creator J. Michael Straczynski and Paramount over, he pitched Babylon 5 as a show and then they didn't accept it. And then a few months later, Deep Space Nine came on the air. I don't know if he's ever really spoken publicly too much about exactly what went down there, but I can certainly see how a figure like Harlan Ellison might show up in his life and put an arm around his shoulder and offer his support, having both been spurned by the Star Trek franchise.
Yeah, I could definitely see that happening. And I think it's kind of like a weird tonal mismatch as well, because when we talked about Star Trek previously, we talk about how it's so it's very moral and it's always on the side of good and educating people in how to be good, basically. And Harlan Ellison is sort of like you said, he's got that sort of darker tone to his writing, and things seem a bit more murky in the kind of stuff that he's depicting. And I think there was one, again, I did a little bit of reading as well. And there was one thing which I read somewhere, I can't remember where it was, but it was something like in the original script, they had Scotty dealing drugs in the episode. So like having that as like such a dark thing to be happening amongst the crew, which would never sort of happen in Gene Roddenberry's like universe. I can see how that would be sort of like something which they would sort of clash about. Yeah,
it puts the blame on Scotty for the events of the episode, I think, the original script, because so Bones goes completely mad because he's accidentally jabbed himself with a hypodermic needle full of, I don't know, like crazy, they do give it a name, but it's some sort of like techno-babble version of adrenaline or something like that, isn't it? And yeah, the original script called for Scotty to have been a drug dealer, and that's presumably what drove Bones crazy. And you can see how Roddenberry would need to step in at that point and be like, love your script here, Harlan, but this isn't the vibe of my show. And yeah, it's because of like Gene Roddenberry's utopic ideal for Star Trek. But I guess you've also got to think of it from a producer's point of view, which Gene Roddenberry would have also had to do, which is, I can't have one of my main characters being a drug dealer in one episode and then next week he's just going to be like fixing the engines like he always does. Like that's you can't just make a main character into such a scummy guy. That's really going to cause problems.
Well, Scotty, now you've done it.
Aye, the haggis is in the fire for sure.
So how does the actual time travel in the City on the Edge of Forever function?
Well, it's all due to a mystical portal, isn't it? It's something it's a big portal which kind of looks a bit like the Stargate, doesn't it? But it's just made out of rocks.
Oh yeah, it is kind of like the Stargate, isn't it? I thought it was a little bit almost Lovecraftian, because it was just this ancient, mysterious structure that was older than Spock could fathom and more complicated than Spock could fathom and all that. And it had these amazing abilities. It seemed like this creepy, mystical thing out of a Lovecraft story that's just plonked there with no explanation and drives the events of the episode. But a little bit strange for Star Trek in that regard.
Yeah, and it's called the Guardian of All Time, isn't it? This weird sort of like construction which is going to be their means of time travel. So the crew are going around in space like they normally do every episode. They're touring the galaxy, boldly going where no man has gone before. So they get there and there's this weird sort of like temporal anomaly, isn't there? As there are in a few of the other episodes we look at. There's some sort of...
you picked up on that, did you? Yeah. A temporal abnormality, ripples in time. Yeah, we'll get back into that because they really go off the deep end on that in one of the DS9 episodes.
It's great fun though, and it's a great way to sort of like just kick off an episode. But yeah, so they're exploring this temporal anomaly, and yeah, there's this Guardian of Forever, I think is what they call it.
Yeah, very grandiose, which is the Stargate, the Lovecraftian Stargate ring, and it starts talking to them in this booming voice and gives some, he kind of speaks in riddles, but also riddles that give a load of exposition as well, like moving the plot forward, and basically says, well, what's his function? I guess that's kind of unclear. He's just like there to show you the past.
Yeah, he does speak in like weird riddles as well, doesn't he? He's like, I'm not here to tell you what to do with me, but yeah, you can go to whenever you want, and you have the power, basically.
And it seems like the plot is going in one direction, which is that Kirk sees utility in this potential time machine, which is, well, it's whizzing through all time. We can just jump into last week and stop Bones from ever injecting himself with the crazy juice, which seems like a sort of classic setup for a time travel Star Trek episode. And just as they're debating that, Bones just leaps up and just like dives head first through the time portal.
I've got to say, Bones, like high on adrenaline or whatever it is just the maddest thing in this episode. He is running around like an absolute crazy person, and he does like the classic karate chop to get on the teleporters so he can get onto the planet in the first place. But yeah, like you said, he just runs off and he's just like, I'm going in there now. This is where I'm going. And they have to basically chase after him for the episode, don't they?
Yeah, he's amazing. He's all karate and judo. The judo chop is essential Starfleet combat maneuvers in the original series of Star Trek. Everyone's judo chopping, or they're doing that punch where you clasp both hands together and then like swing both your arms sideways. A lot of that going on in the original series, I noticed. But yeah, he's going crazy. He's like screaming, assassins, murderers. He's injected himself with this drug that is, ostensibly good for you because it saves Sulu's life, but too much of it just makes you go absolutely wild, just screaming at everyone. And that's what DeForest Kelley gets to do for the majority of this episode. And then he gets to do it in the past. But they do arrive in the past, don't they? So Kirk and Spock go after him, and they appear in, when is it? It's like 1930s.
It's the Great Depression, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's right on the cusp of the Great Depression. What did you think about seeing Kirk and Spock like interacting with 1930s America?
I thought that was really good. But also, like, the weird thing I thought about with the time travel as well is, so it's flicking through like all of time. So they're seeing the whole of everything from like when it was made to when it's destroyed or whatever, and it's just going round and round and round, and then they have to really carefully find the exact moment where McCoy is, and that seemed like a bit glossed over. I mean, they have to for this kind of episode.
Yeah, it's not explained in detail, but they do jam a little bit of dialogue in for Spock to explain how he does it. He kind of berates himself just before Bones jumps through. He's like, oh, I should be recording this. It's a great opportunity. I should be using my tricorder to record the images. So he just flicks that on to record right as McCoy jumps through. So then Spock says, oh, I can use the recording to line it up or whatever, and I can give you a heads up, and we'll jump through at the exact right moment. That's how they do it. But you're absolutely right that the images in the portal are, I mean, yeah, they're whizzing through from like ancient Rome, and then it's like Hitler giving a speech. So we're covering like 1,000 years in just a few seconds. So it's a bit of a stretch that Spock's able to just like say, oh, go now.
But I quite like that idea. It kind of like adds a bit of jeopardy to it, that you can only jump in at that specific point and that they have to make sure they're right.
Well, yeah, I thought the jeopardy was really good, actually. And it gave it a nice, serious note, which was right before they do jump through, Kirk has to turn around and give orders to the rest of the crew that, like, you need to jump through. If we don't come back in a few seconds, you need to go through. Because at this point, Bones going through the portal has wiped out the entirety of the Enterprise, and they're just stranded on this planet. So he gives them some like really depressing orders, which is, you've got to jump through, try and find Bones, but even if you can't, you've got to do it because it's your only hope at having any kind of life is to disappear into the past and just get on with it, which is like an insane thing for your commanding officer to say to you right before he jumps into a disappearing portal.
Yeah, because you're right, that's the main jeopardy in it, because if they don't succeed, they know that everything's going to be gone. There's going to be no Starfleet. They need to sort that out. They need to find Bones. But going back to your point initially, so Kirk and Spock in the 1930s, it's brilliant. I love the first thing that they do is try and get some clothes, and they try and steal some, and then get caught by the policeman straight away. It's just like, that's exactly the kind of thing which would happen if you were running around dressed like you're from Star Trek.
Yeah, they're not very good at concealing themselves. They do. There's quite a lot when they first get there of them just standing in a corner and shielding their eyes as if they're hiding from everyone. But yeah, they're standing in their full outfit, so it's fairly obvious that they're out of place. But I quite like the way they just drop in and they're like, we've got to steal some clothes, we've got to break into this building, we've got to get somewhere to sleep and all of that. It felt very like a war movie, like a Black Ops kind of war movie. They're dropped in with no resources and they've just got to like make do. But they're both military men, they're naval men essentially in Starfleet. So they do what they've got to do. They're mission focused and they just get on with it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. They think about all of the things that they need to sort of cover up about themselves, and they try and think of an elaborate sort of reason as to why they're dressed like that, why Spock's ears are the way they are, and they sort of like, they try and come up with all this stuff really quickly and off the cuff. And again, I think you're right, because they're sort of like trained that way. They're trained to be able to deal with these kind of situations. So if we're talking time travelers, they're competent time travelers because they've got that expertise and they've got that sort of military training. And we've seen that in a few other things, haven't we? Sort of like, there are a few instances where we've seen people which are more efficient. Like, so Wolverine in Days of Future Past, he's an X-Man. He's like, knows what he's doing, is mission focused. He's got that about him. And it's when we see characters with that kind of like almost militaristic background, they're able to sort of delve into these situations and take it by the reins and just get going.
Yeah, and a little bit of Bruce Willis in both 12 Monkeys and Looper, that he's a very roughened character who's gone through a hard life, so is able to be really scrappy and resourceful in the past and just get what he needs done. A similar thing, a less honourable type of character than the kind of the military guys with their training, but it's the same mentality of a time traveller who is just very confident, focused, and competent.
I think I'm going to like this century. Simple, easier to manage. We're not going to have any difficulty explaining.
Well?
You're a police officer. I recognize the traditional accoutrements.
You were saying you'll have no trouble explaining it.
So then we're in the past, and then it kind of just turns into a love story, doesn't it?
Yeah, Joan Collins pops up, doesn't she?
The Joan Collins arrives.
Yeah, I had to do a double take because I've never seen her at that age. So I was like, wait, is that Joan Collins? Oh, it is. It is Joan Collins.
Yeah, she plays she runs a mission. Is it a mission or like a soup kitchen type place? But she's also just got a bit of a thing for giving lectures about the possibility of space travel. What do you think of that?
It did seem a bit forced, that. But like, just her in general, she's like very idealized, especially by Kirk. Like there's the classic soft focus whenever you see a close-up of her and all that kind of stuff.
So much soft focus.
Yeah, they're really sort of going in for that. And obviously in all these older Star Trek episodes, I think there's a lot of moments when Kirk is sort of like got a love interest and he's sort of like making the moves, being the sort of suave guy. And that's exactly what he starts off doing in this, doesn't he?
It's the stereotype of Kirk, yeah, that he just shacks his way around the galaxy. And, he does to an extent. But this is definitely played more as a romance. It's not just like a fling with some alien on a planet. He's there for actually, I mean, he is only there for like a week, isn't he? And then he's like declaring that he's in love with Edith. But
she's on board with that relationship as well, because she refers to him as her man or her like gentleman friend, something like that. So they're definitely sort of like on the verge of a proper relationship from the scene, like from the outside looking in.
Yeah, and then how much did you sort of see what was coming in the plot and what was going to happen with that?
I didn't really see it coming, to be honest. It did sort of like take me back a bit because I knew they were going to have to sort of like leave her there, and I thought that was going to be the big thing, like, oh, Kirk doesn't want to leave her or something like that. But yeah, they really go a bit left field with it, don't they?
Yeah. Well, I vaguely remembered that she died, and that was like going to be the major like twist ending of the episode. But I thought that they did something much more interesting with it, which is that Spock's tinkering away with some machine that's going to help them. I don't really know what the machine does, but he's tinkering. And when the machine's complete, it allows him to like scan news broadcasts into the future. I think that's what he's doing.
Yeah, and he's made it out of scraps and stuff, hasn't he? And he makes a big point about how he's not got the equipment to do it.
Yeah, but Kirk's like, well, it seems like a logical problem, Mr. Spock. And he kind of challenges his intellect. I really like that, especially because it's a first season episode, but that kind of like banter between the two characters is what people love to this day about the show. So, and why those characters have lasted such a long time. So I loved seeing that back and forth between them.
Yeah, he definitely baits him into doing it, doesn't he?
Yeah, and it works. Spock is easily baited into doing stuff by challenging his intelligence or his logical prowess. So he builds this machine, and yeah, it sees into the future for them. And he establishes that Edith Keeler is either going to die or not, but they don't know for certain whether McCoy's interference causes her to die or causes her not to die. So they don't know which thing they need to set right, and they have no way of knowing it. And then I think he gets more information, doesn't he? And if she lives, she's going to be this like amazing force for good in the United States, and a really passionate pacifist. But to the extent where she even like convinces the president not to go to war with Germany, which I mean, and all this sounds amazing. Like, oh, she's a saint. This is great. She's reducing warfare, and oh, amazing. But then it's like, but because the US doesn't join the war, Germany develops the A-bomb, and the Nazis take over the world.
Yeah. It's such a, like you said, it's a really interesting use of time travel here, because we've looked at a lot of time travel stories now, but this is the first time I've really seen this kind of thing. So like you've got a character who you become attached to, and then it turns out that they're not supposed to be there and they need to get rid of them. And it just, again, it's like all adding to the jeopardy of the episode. And bearing in mind, this is only like, 50 minutes or something, this whole episode. So they're really packing it all in, and all this sort of like big stuff is happening throughout the episode.
Edith Keeler, founder of the peace movement.
But she was right. Peace was the way.
She was right, but at the wrong time. With the A-bomb and with their V-2 rockets to carry them, Germany captured the world.
No.
And all this because McCoy came back and somehow kept her from dying in a street accident, as she was meant to.
With that realization that she essentially would delay the US entry into the World War II if she lives, they realize that the thing that Bones is going to do is stop her from dying, and they need to stop him from stopping her from dying, but they still don't know how that's going to happen. So it's still quite tense right up until the last couple of minutes. But it did make me think, is this situation with Edith, is this a reverse killing baby Hitler situation that we talked about before?
I suppose it is, because you're having to kill the person to make sure that everything's the way it should be.
Yeah. It's like, well, they have to make sure that, so the principle with killing baby Hitler is, could you kill a baby because the baby's going to grow up and do terrible things? This is allowing a good person to die so that you can ensure that Hitler is defeated. It's the same sort of principle that you have to allow or cause an awful event in order to stop Hitler from well, in this case, it's stop Hitler doing anything more than what he already did, and taking over the world. But I think the principle is kind of the same, that you have to do something that you find morally objectionable. And in this case, it's allowing a woman that you love to die in order to ensure that Hitler is still stopped in 1945 as he was in the original timeline.
Yeah, and that does speak to sort of like Harlan Ellison's sort of way of writing stuff, because he has that really dark moment in this, but that, because it's so different to your average Star Trek episode, it sticks in your mind. And I think that's part of the reason it's done so well this episode and been so critically acclaimed, because it's got that weight to it, and it makes it an important moment in Star Trek history.
Yeah, and I think the weight of that morality also helps it fit within the ethos of Star Trek that Gene Roddenberry was trying to create. Even though it's not a happy utopia, it's still showing you characters who are willing to make these very difficult personal compromises in order to do something noble for a greater good, which is protecting the timeline and not allowing Hitler to take over the world at the end of World War II. So it's difficult for the characters, and it's maybe a little bit upsetting to see for the audience, but it's that idea of sacrifice for the greater good that I think does slot into the utopia idea of Starfleet.
And I think sort of the idea that Star Trek and the Star Trek universe is based around sort of like a utopian society feeds quite nicely into the other two episodes which you've sort of like put up for us to look at, which is Past Tense, parts 1 and 2 from Deep Space Nine.
What is this place?
Sanctuary District.
21st century history is not one of my strong points. Too depressing.
It's been a hobby of mine. They made some ugly mistakes, but they also paved the way for a lot of things we now take for granted.
Yes, Past Tense, parts 1 and 2, series 3, episodes 11 and 12 from Deep Space Nine. I love these episodes. I remember them really well as just like a really standout DS9 episode, so I was glad that we could do them for this episode. Have you seen these ones before, or was this new for you?
I had not seen these two. I might have seen them way back when, but I certainly didn't remember them. And they're very political as well. I was surprised how political they get in these two.
I mean, they feel more political than ever in the context of today. But I mean, it did remind me of when we talked about Demolition Man and what was going on politically and culturally in America around the time that film came out. So series 3 of Deep Space Nine would have been sort of mid to late 90s, so a few years after Demolition Man, or like the year after or something like that. But still certainly like fresh in the public's mind. So it's interesting in the same way as Demolition Man that those things come back around and we're still talking about it, nearly 30 years later. But we'll get into that. Let's before we get into what the actual sort of political social themes they're talking about, we need to talk about how they get there. It's an absolute classic Star Trek malhappening. There's a transporter malfunction and they're sent through time. What did you think of that? Because it really is a classic Star Trek trope.
I just loved all of the explanation for it. Like, they just got chrono and temporal in there as much as possible. And they did it like early on before they actually knew that Cisco and everyone had gone back in time. So I think that I wrote it down. They use chronotron particles and temporal energy are two of the sort of like name checks they have there.
I wrote down more than that, James, because they kept on going back to Chief O'Brien trying to explain it to Major Kira. The full summary is that there was a power fluctuation in the annular confinement beam, which was reacting to the accumulated chronoton particles in the ship's ablative armor matrix, which are emitted by the cloaking device on the Defiant, which was shifted into a high state of temporal polarization by a temporal surge caused by an explosion of a microscopic singularity passing through the solar system. So the transporter beam was redirected through time and not space. That's compressing like 4 Chief O'Brien scenes into one techno-babble sentence.
Does that make sense to you as a Star Trek fan?
No, of course not. I don't like. What's a chronoton particle?
It was a simple adjustment. The beam was just reacting to the accumulation of chronoton particles in the ship's hull.
Chronoton particles?
They're emitted by the cloaking device. They sometimes become lodged in the ship's ablative armor matrix.
But we've used the transporter many times since the cloaking device was installed. There's never been a problem before.
I don't know why there should be one now.
Oh, that is so good. But I love that. I love all of that sort of like scientific gobbledygook that they've literally just written to try and come up with an explanation for the time travel in this. It's brilliant.
Yeah, they really do that sort of thing more and more in the later Star Trek shows. And I also did sort of wonder if, because this is a two-parter, there was a little bit more filler time to make this run for a full 2 episodes. So there was good reason to come back to Chief O'Brien. Like, if Chief O'Brien just said, oh, there was some chronoton particles in the way, like the first time it happened, no one's going to be like, why didn't Chief O'Brien explain what was going on more? You know, I don't think we needed to come back to them on the Defiant trying to figure things out as many times as we did.
But they've got their explanation there. They've told us what's going on. The transporter's gone a bit iffy, and then they've ended up in a different time period.
Yeah, and when is it?
The early 2020s. 2024 I've got down here in my notes.
Oh, right. Yeah. It's just in our very near future at the time of recording, just 4 years away. Although it would have been
a bit scary because things could go that way sometimes, I feel.
Well, yeah, I mean, so Sisko sets the kind of tone of the 2 episodes by explaining he's well read on this period of Earth's history. They've arrived at the site of the Bell riots, which is the single most violent instance of civil disobedience in Earth history, and they've arrived like a week before it's due to happen in the place where it's due to happen, which is essentially like a slum in San Francisco.
It's like a ghetto, isn't it?
Yeah. And every city in America apparently has one of these sanctuary districts. It's where people go when they have no jobs, but they just get packed in and the conditions are awful and there's not enough food, and, you know, the hoi polloi in the rest of the city just ignore it, and, you know, it's a glorified prison and not a nice prison.
And they make a point with the characters that anyone could end up living in this sanctuary. All it takes is just you get fired from a job and then suddenly you're not able to pay your rent and everything, and then you end up in this sanctuary. Like, it's quite easy for good working people to end up there.
Which is a completely relatable circumstance for 99.99% of Star Trek's audience, which is that if you did lose your job, for most people that does mean like you could be destitute after 6 bad months, 4 bad months, for some people 1 bad week. You know, you could lose everything because, you know, how many of us are earning so much more than our rent that we can afford to just, you know, just lose that job. So yeah, it felt very real. It felt very very close to the bone. And just so interesting that an episode written in like 1993, 1994 would have been making those points that are still completely relevant 30 years later. And from a time travel perspective, what I really liked about that was it was both, it's a time travel adventure for the characters who are going back in time, but it's speculative fiction for the audience because it's set 25, 30 years in the future at the time of writing. So it's kind of doing both of those things at once. It's looking into the future and the characters are looking back. So you can stretch out into the future and say how bad things are going to get, while also having characters saying how good things are going to get after that bad period, because they are from a better utopia future. And this is just a lull, and everything depressing happening. You know, we can do so much better. Things are going to get better, but we have to get through these bad times.
That's it. And I really like that sort of message that this episode had, because so Sisko and everyone are bringing their utopian views to 2024. And in doing that, they're sort of like, they're seeing stuff and they're like, why can't the people of this time see how easy it is to solve these problems? Like, they talk about a lot of the social problems that are going on, and they say like, because they split them off in this weird sort of time period into gimmies and dims, don't they? So dims are anybody who's got some sort of like
mental, or I think also physical illness.
So yeah, so anybody who's got like a mental or physical illness are classed as dims. And they say like there's one character who's got schizophrenia, and they go, well, we could cure that if they just focused on that for a bit. They could cure that in no time. And they do that. They keep commenting on things like that if everyone just sort of like came together, they could overcome all these problems that they're facing in these sanctuaries.
Yeah, and what they're tiptoeing around there is that Bashir is saying that they need socialized healthcare in America, and they don't say that, because that would have, I think, that would have been a problem like for the network putting that on air. And that is essentially what the Federation is. It's a socialist utopia. Everyone's chipping in. Everyone's got a job. No one, there's no poverty. I think some of the later types of Star Trek get into everything's not as good on Earth as you think, but that's the basis of the Federation. But Bashir's just describing, the NHS. Like, he knows what the medicine was like in 2024, and he knows that there are treatments for those conditions, and he just says if they just had access to that medicine, they'd be functioning members of society. And that's what he's commenting on. And he's there. Yeah, it's interesting to see those characters from a utopia being brought back to give commentary on the pre-utopia society.
And it's painful for them as well. You can see that they're sort of like frustrated seeing all of this in that time period because they can't interfere. They're not supposed to be doing anything. But of course, they get roped in and they end up having to do a lot of interfering, don't they?
Yes. So Sisko identifies that it's days before the Bell riots, which is this civil uprising, and like several hundred people are going to die in this sanctuary district because of those riots. But he puts the positive spin on it because those riots draw attention to the issues and I got the impression it sets into motion a domino effect of positive change that will ultimately become the foundation of the Federation. That these changes in society are going to be an incredibly good thing. So they can't do anything, and they're going to have to, if they can't get home, they're going to have to stand by and watch several hundred people die. What I thought was really interesting about that is Bashir talks about that in the context of like a Starfleet temporal training. There's guidelines for this sort of situation, and he's saying how difficult it is to, I understand the guidelines, but it's going to be very difficult to watch hundreds of people die. What did you think of the guidelines and the training that they must have gone through in Starfleet for this situation?
I thought that was interesting because it's kind of already making reference to the City on the Edge of Forever in terms of like what's happening in this episode. So as in with that episode, the main thing that's happened is that the crew, which are back in the present, so Chief O'Brien and everyone, they're in a present where there is no Starfleet. So exactly the same thing's happened. They've sort of like, something has changed in the past that has had that knock-on effect. So it's interesting seeing that. So this is like something where the guidelines come in, because this has happened before. They have to know how to get out of this situation in order to not completely fuck up all of time.
Yeah, I really like that. It fleshes out the Star Trek world, doesn't it? Because certainly at this point, we've had 3 seasons of Star Trek, some animated episodes, 7 seasons of Next Generation, and now we're on DS9. There's been a lot of time travel in the Star Trek franchise. So it stands to reason that they would, over the hundreds of years of Star Trek content, it stands to reason they would have introduced some training for their navy, that guys, if you find yourself traveling through time, it seems to happen quite a lot to our to colleagues of ours, please just don't mess anything up, don't get involved, just protect the timeline. Or wait, I guess it doesn't really say protect the timeline, does it? The principle is to not get involved, because there's a difference between protecting the timeline and not affecting the timeline. So they're trying to do the latter, which is just don't affect it, don't get involved. But then when they identify that changes have happened, they take a more proactive role in protecting and restoring the timeline.
Yeah, and that big change is, of course, the fact that Bell ends up getting killed. So the man who organizes all these riots and sort of like brings about this massive change in society is killed in a scuffle. So with that happening, Sisko kind of takes on his name, doesn't he, in order to sort of make things as close to the original timeline as possible.
Yes, he steps into the role of Gabriel Bell and gives his name as, I think he gives his name as Gabriel Bell, doesn't he, when they stumble into the riots and become part of the rioters holding the hostages. But Sisko knows that if he doesn't do something and play the role that Bell played, then all of these hostages will die. because that's what Bell did. It was saving the hostages at the cost of his own life that made him into this heroic, mythical figure, that he would sacrifice himself, even with the conditions in the sanctuary. He would sacrifice himself to protect people's lives who were not members of the sanctuary district.
And I found it interesting in the contrast to the sanctuary district and everything that's going on there is the sort of like B storyline of Dax being with the richer people in society. And I also sort of like noticed that, so Dax is kind of like built for time travel, isn't she? Because she's been around for years and she's been like a guy, a girl. She's been in all these different roles. She knows what society's been like throughout the years. She really quickly adapts to being in a different time period. I think she's the person who I've seen adapt to time travel the quickest in all of the stuff we've looked at, because I wasn't sure if she knew if she was back in time when she first meets the guy who sort of like helps her out, because she's very quick to be like, oh no, I must have been mugged. She knows exactly what to do, doesn't she?
They get into that more in the next episode that we're going to talk about, in the Tribbles episode. Her age being a factor in her ability to be a good time traveler. This is before that. This is 2 seasons before, and you're right, there's no real explanation. She wakes up, the CEO guy, Chris, I think his name is helping her, and she's like, oh, thank God, I've got my brooch. She doesn't call it her communicator badge, she calls it her brooch, which is really...
See, even that.
Yeah, that's really savvy. She's obviously like, it's one of the first things she says after regaining consciousness, but she's obviously clocked something about her surroundings. Cisco does clock it really quickly as well. He's saying stuff like, well, you know, what's up with that gun that the security guard's got? And as soon as he says sanctuary district, he's like, sanctuary district? What year is this? Because he knows the history well enough. But you're absolutely right. Jadzia just clocks it. The second she wakes up, she seems to be aware that she's awoken 400 or 500 years earlier.
And seeing that other side of society is really good in terms of sort of like getting all these political things out there as well, because you are seeing how the people, the super rich people are living this life of luxury, and then the straight up comparison between that and the people in the sanctuaries is very clear. So that's quite a good way of showing that.
Yeah, there's like a 99%, 1% distance between those characters, isn't there? Because Jadzia gets taken to like cocktail parties and stuff while we're seeing the horrible events that are happening in the sanctuary, which is presumably, you know, just a few hundred yards or a couple of miles down the road from where they are.
Exactly. And you see how clueless the 1% are with these kind of things. They just have no idea that these are just ordinary people. They kind of think of them as being like completely separate from them. There must be something wrong with them, something different. And then that's sort of like put to rest with the stuff that happens when they're with the hostages. And when they finally, so Cisco ends up getting video messages sent out of the people living in the sanctuary telling their stories. And then when that comes out, the sort of like the 1% and the people which are better off can see that these people are in need of help, and they can relate to their stories more.
Yeah. I think they even, don't they even have a line where they're like essentially gossiping about what's going on in other countries? They're saying like Europe's just gone to shit, and thank God we're all right over here. They're just kind of completely ignorant as to what's going on in the sanctuary until these riots shed a light on it.
Yeah, it's very telling that, isn't it?
Yeah, really good. Really well written.
Why are these people in here? Are they criminals?
You know, people with criminal records weren't allowed in the sanctuary districts.
Then what do they do to deserve this?
Nothing. Just people. Without jobs or places to live.
So they get put in here?
Welcome to the 21st century, Doctor.
Oh, they're right there.
So while all this is going on, O'Brien is he's done explaining what's happened to Kira. It takes him about half an hour, but he does that, and they decide they need to form an away team to recreate the accident with the transporter and go back in time. How did you find the scenes where they're just like teleporting down to the same street in San Francisco at different times?
It was a bit of light relief, wasn't it, from everything, all the seriousness that's going on throughout the episode. So yes, they pop up in like the 60s, and there's like a stoned guy who comes out of his van and he sort of like throws up the peace sign and stuff like that. And then they go to like Again, they go to the 30s, I think, and then they're just getting little snapshots of different time periods, which are very clear to understand. So I quite enjoyed that because, again, it was just like a nice little funny bit, but it did feel a bit sort of fillery as well at the same time.
Yeah, it's a bit of comic relief, isn't it? But it is essentially filler, as Star Trek two-parters can often be. I don't know if they've always got the plot for 90 minutes of television, but we do get to have a bit of fun with it. And Kira gets to wear like a bandage over her nose so that she won't be identified as Bajoran, like similar to Spock covering his ears, to hide these little tells. Whereas Jadzia can get away with it because her spots, they basically just look like elaborate tattoos.
So you can see the contrast with O'Brien and Kira in the way they're handling themselves in these sort of like time travel scenarios. Again, the comical relief, because Kira just blurts out that she's broken her nose really quickly just to get to the point, because she knows that's part of her backstory. And it's just, they don't handle it in the sort of like the naval officer way that we've seen previously.
Yeah, but that works. I mean, it is just comic relief, but that does still fit nicely with what we've been told, because Kira's a Bajoran, resistance fighter. She's not Starfleet. And O'Brien is an enlisted man. I don't understand. I've never understood the whole enlisted man versus officer thing in the US Navy and in Star Trek. But my understanding is he hasn't had the same degree of Starfleet training that all the officers have had, because they are officers, and he stays the chief. He's just an enlisted man. So yeah, it kind of fits. They don't know the temporal guidelines maybe, so they're just sort of bumbling about trying to get it right. I did quite like that after all of that technobabble at the start of part 1 with O'Brien explaining it, he narrows it down to 3 possible time periods, and they've only got enough chronoton particles for one trip. And he basically just guesses, and Kira's like, just take a guess, I don't mind. And the way they figure it out is a 1 in 3 guess. After all of that technobabble, it's just pure luck that gets them to the right period.
Yeah, it's pretty risky. And it's nice that it's on their last attempt as well, that they end up where they need to get to.
Yeah, the Jeopardy, I don't know, it wasn't handled the same way as the City on the Edge of Forever, where they have to like wrestle with the idea of being trapped in time. It was more like, let's just have another wang at it and see if we can get it right this time. But in terms of Jeopardy, I guess the main thing hanging over the episode is that we know that Gabriel Bell dies in the riots, and that is essentially the same as Edith Keeler's death in The City on the Edge of Forever. It's an event that the characters, against their desires maybe, have to allow to happen in order to protect the timeline. And that Jeopardy is ramped up even more. It's not just a character that someone's fallen in love with this episode. It's our main character who has taken on the role that has to die by the end. How did you see it playing out? So you said you were taken by surprise by Edith Keeler dying in the original series episode. What did you think was going to happen? Sisko doesn't die, but there is some jeopardy there. What did you think was going to happen?
Yeah, I could kind of see this one coming. I was like, he's either going to get transported out at the right time or something like that's going to happen. There's going to be something which happens to him that looks like he's died, but he'll be fine. But it was important that they did have that jeopardy again, because you've got to have that thing hanging over you when you're doing sort of time travel stuff to make that really work. And sort of like you put down in like our notes as well, it's kind of like a predestination paradox that it sort of like ends like that. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that's sort of like so fundamental in this?
Well, I don't know if it is a predestination paradox. I kind of think that they're trying to write it so that it's not a predestination paradox. But what happens is Sisko goes back in time, becomes Bell because he knows who Bell is, and that's the only reason he steps into that role. That is a bit of a predestination paradox, because he then becomes the famous man of history that he read about, and he knows how important he is, and that's why he becomes him, and so on and so on.
It'd be weird if that had always been how it was supposed to have been, like you said, like a predestination paradox, and he'd seen a picture of Bell, and then he realised that picture was him. That would have been really weird.
Well, that's what happens at the end. You mean if he'd seen the picture...
If he'd seen it prior to actually travelling back in time, because he knows all this stuff about Bell. If he'd seen a picture and was like, oh, he looks a lot like me, and then it all turns out to be him who's Bell in the first place.
But he doesn't recognise Bell, I don't think. No, he doesn't recognize Bell at all when Bell shows up. Bell shows up to save them and dies. And they kind of search his body, and Cisco takes his ID card, and that's how he figures out it's Bell. So Cisco's never seen Bell, or at least doesn't remember what he looks like. But I suppose you're right. If he had seen Bell when learning about him, he would have, well, maybe he would have been a younger man, 40-odd-year-old Cisco might not look like what Cisco looked like when he was learning about Bell in school or in the academy.
Yeah, so that's the tricky time travel stuff, isn't it? Because maybe that was always supposed to happen. And that's sort of like there was another thing in the City on the Edge of Forever, like the way they treat time travel, because I think Spock says something about it being like a river in that one, doesn't he? So is that sort of like the same thing? Can you change that river's flow? Or is it always supposed to be that way?
Yeah, and that's important in that episode because it's that justification about being unable to change the flow, which is a persuasive argument to Kirk to allow Keeler to die, and also the stuff with Hitler, obviously. But I don't know. There are things at the end of the past tense episodes that makes me think they don't want it to be seen like a predestination paradox, and I think it comes down to what's happening with the Defiant. So, like you said, it's similar to the City on the Edge of Forever, where the ship is remaining consistent in time, and Starfleet disappears around it. Or even, the Enterprise does disappear above the planet in the original series episode. But we've got these immune time travelers who the bubble of time travel immunity is extended to, and they bear witness to the changes to the timeline. So I guess it's not a predestination paradox because Kira and the Defiant observe that they have made changes to the timeline by allowing Bell to die. So that really was the original Bell, and he really was destined to change the world, and his death undid those events, and then Cisco intervenes and redoes the events. Does that make sense? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. And of course they have to report it, don't they? They have to report it to Starfleet, everything that's happened. So in that case, they've got like a written record of how it was and how it's supposed to have changed.
Yeah, and Cisco's like dreading having to explain that to Starfleet Command when he sees his own image in the history books. But it's kind of like a little joke, but it does tee us up nicely for the next episode that we're going to be talking about, doesn't it?
Yes. So in the next episode, they do a lot of references to the original series, don't they? So let's talk about Series 5, Episode 6 from Deep Space Nine, Trials and Tribulations.
What was the date of your arrival?
Stardate 4523.7.
105 years, 1 month, 12 days ago.
A Friday.
What was the Enterprise doing?
She was orbiting one of the old deep space stations, K7, near the Klingon border. Security reported that just before we were thrown back in time, someone stunned the deputy who was guarding the orb and broke into the cabin. It didn't take us long to realize who it was.
So this episode is introduced with a framing device, which is that so like I said in the previous episode, it's almost a joke that Cisco's going to have to explain himself to Starfleet Command, and we've been introduced to the idea of temporal guidelines and stuff. Trials and Tribulations starts with him explaining himself to Starfleet Command via the Temporal Agency. Is that what they're called? I can't remember their name, but that's their function, isn't it? So we've got this faction of Starfleet who are solely responsible for keeping an eye on all the time travel that's happening. So I like the way it extends that idea from past tense, which is that Starfleet officers would be trained to how to handle things if they travel through time. It stands to reason there would also be a department who then investigates those incidents and has to act on them.
Yeah, because it's happened so many times, like you said in Star Trek episodes previously. They have to have some sort of agency in place to look after this.
Yeah, it's happened a lot of times. I dare say it's happened 17 times for Captain Kirk alone, I assume, because the time travel event that Cisco has to explain is that they go back in time to Captain Kirk's day and end up on the Enterprise. And one of the temporal agents makes a reference to Kirk and says, 17 separate violations of the temporal code. I'm willing to bet that if you count the original series, the animated series, and all the movies, I'll bet there's 17 time travel plots in total. And that was a reference to that.
They've definitely made sure that number matches up, haven't they?
Yeah, I think so. So, like I said, they're going back to the Tribbles episode. Did you get a chance to watch the Tribbles episode?
Yep, I watched the Tribbles episode on a Saturday morning, like I was a kid again, and it was an absolute treat. I really enjoyed it. It was just like, it's funny, it's like quirky, it's just a really solid episode. And I know how famous it is as well, because the Tribble episode is known sort of like amongst Star Trek fans and non-Star Trek fans. Everyone knows that bit where Captain Kirk is reaching up for that hatch and then all the Tribbles come pouring down on him.
Yeah, that's a really iconic moment. And in all fairness, it's a really iconic episode. But it's a very strange episode to become such an iconic one. It's so interesting to compare it to The City on the Edge of Forever, which is very dark and serious and sad. Which is one of the most iconic episodes as well. But in terms of iconic imagery, it's like the Tribbles, really, and the fighting with the Klingons in the bar. That's the stuff that is really memorable. And it's arguably one of the silliest episodes of the whole show.
Oh, it is really silly, but it's great, isn't it? It's so much fun.
I mean, yeah, no, I loved it. What did you think, though? Because I sent you these episodes to watch, and I told you to watch The Trouble with Tribbles before you watched the DS9 one. And you knew that we were recording for time travel. What did you think was going on?
Well, I knew there was going to be some sort of reference to it. I didn't know how deep the reference was going to be, but this was a really interesting case because it's kind of like what we were talking about with the franchises and revisiting sort of like your universe. That's exactly what they do in this. And I think I read somewhere that they kind of got the idea from watching Forrest Gump and then all the sort of like composites on that. They said, okay, if we can sort of like do that with Star Trek, is there sort of like a lower budget way we can do that and revisit one of the past episodes?
Oh, right. I didn't know that was the inspiration for it. But yeah, that was the reasoning for it. I think it was the 30th anniversary, wasn't it? Does this, we said it was a really silly episode. Is this a good choice of episode to celebrate your 30 years on television?
I think it's like a fun way of doing it because you could have gone down the serious angle. Like if you looked at an episode like The City on the Edge of Forever, which is like critically acclaimed, but it's a much moodier piece. I don't think it would be celebrating Star Trek in the same way because this is all about sort of like celebrating the fun of it. And they do have a lot of fun in this episode. So I think it would have been the wrong move to look at one of the sort of like maybe more serious ones.
Yeah, you're quite right. It's such a long shot to put the episode together. So it needs to be quite light-hearted so that you can just slot your characters into the background and have your own plot going on. So you don't need to worry about the drama of what's going on with Kirk and crew because we're actually focusing on Cisco and Dax and that lot and what they're doing in the background of those scenes. So yeah, I kind of get that. They did do a much more serious anniversary episode on Voyager. So at this point in the broadcast, DS9 and Voyager were on at the same time, and they do a similar thing in terms of revisiting the original series, but they don't do it by splicing the footage together. It's I think Tuvok he has to go back into his mind and remember when he served aboard Sulu's ship, so they get George Takei to come back and play an older Sulu who is commanding a ship that Tuvok works on. I can't remember much more than that, but that's how they revisit those older characters, but without using old footage. They create a new story out of it.
That's interesting because they're doing a similar thing in Star Trek Lower Decks, the animated one. So in that one, they've got older characters and they're now the captains of the ship. So I think it's Riker. I think Riker is the captain of one of the ships. And then they've got Deanna Troi in there as well.
Well, as much as I love to see or hear from Jonathan Frakes and Marina Sirtis, I'm just going to reserve all comments on Lower Decks until I've seen it, which might be never.
It's because it looks like a sort of Rick and Morty style thing, doesn't it? Like I haven't seen any of the episodes, so I don't know how it's gone down with proper Star Trek fans.
I'm absolutely fine with Star Trek being parodied, and I enjoy parodies of Star Trek. I just, I'm not sure how I feel about Star Trek parodying itself. When it can do comedy episodes fine, like with Tribbles, and there's loads of fun episodes, I don't know. But I do need to watch it, so I will reserve my judgment.
It's a bit too meta, isn't it?
But I like what they're doing. I like that they're bringing the characters back, and obviously they do that in that Voyager episode, and that's a really good episode as well. But we haven't talked about how they actually get to the past and how they travel through time. What did you think of that? Because I found it really confusing, and I know Deep Space Nine quite well.
It was just really quick, wasn't it? They've got like a time orb, it's done something, they're back in time. It was just like that.
Yeah, I can't remember the orbs that well. I know the orbs give characters visions in Deep Space Nine, and that's how they like communicate with the Prophet. So I know they're like magical devices.
There was one orb that we talked about when we looked at Star Trek in our space series, like in the very first Deep Space Nine episode. They're sort of introduced then, aren't they? The orbs.
Yeah, he opens the orb and he talks to the prophets for the first time, or something like that. Which is the main function of the orbs, I think, is talking to the prophets. But yeah, he just explains to the temporal agents, like, well, they all do different things, and this one travels through time.
It's a bit Infinity Stones, isn't it?
Yes, it is a bit like that. Yeah, so they get the time stone, orb. And what I liked, having rewatched the Tribbles episode, is that it's stolen by the character from the Tribbles episode who is revealed to be the bad guy, the Klingon spy. And I think it's the same actor, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the same actor.
Because, yeah, he looks the same. He's got the same face, but I don't know, he's aged incredibly well, I guess, was what took me the most by surprise. He didn't look like he'd aged 30 years. He looked great. But yeah, he's the same guy. Presumably Klingons live a really long time, much longer than I thought they did. But that's fine.
Because I was trying to figure out who he was, because at one point I was like, maybe he's the merchant. So in the original episode, the Tribbles episode, there's a guy who's selling the Tribbles, and then his punishment is that he's got to collect all of the Tribbles from the space station until they're all gone, and it's going to take him like X amount of years. So I kind of wanted that to be him and be a slimmed down version of him who's just been spending all of his time collecting the Tribbles, and he wants to go back and then rectify it.
Yeah, that could have been good. I wonder if that actor had passed away and they couldn't get him.
Yeah, quite possibly.
But it sort of slots in. He was a human, so he wouldn't have lived that long. I know that Klingons live longer. I didn't think they lived this long, but it's enough that they can argue that a Klingon spy would have lived this long, and it's the same character still alive. So he wants to go back, and there's significantly more jeopardy injected into the Tribbles plot. What's the jeopardy in the original episode? Like, they're going to lose out on some grain.
Yeah, well, Kirk doesn't even want to be there in the original episode. He's just like, he keeps just taking the piss out of the guy who runs the space station and being like, oh yeah, we'll do this for you just because Starfleet have told us to. So it's kind of more sort of like mocking their job, and then it's got like a little sort of mystery element to it as to what happens at the end. Yeah,
well, it turns out much more serious. It turns out the Klingons were trying to poison thousands of humans. So fair enough, there's some jeopardy at the end, but that's only revealed at the end. That you just think that they're there to protect some grain and possibly protect it from some Tribbles. But yeah, we bring more jeopardy into it because we've got an exploding Tribble on board now. Arn Darvin, the villain, has replaced a Tribble with a bomb, and he's going to become a Klingon hero by killing Kirk. It's another reverse Baby Hitler. He's trying to kill Baby Hitler for Klingons, and in their mind, Baby Hitler is Kirk. So Kirk's going to become this great hero that defeats Klingons all the time, and they hate him, and he can be a hero for killing him. So from his point of view, it's like he's going to go back in time and kill Baby Hitler, young Kirk.
Yeah, it's an interesting premise again, isn't it? Sort of like that idea of going back and then completely changing the timeline into like an alternate version which would profit you.
Yeah. But once again, our characters have to then step in and protect the timeline. That's a real thread in Star Trek time travel episodes. They inadvertently travel through time, or they are brought through time by someone else, something more powerful. And something goes wrong. They have no intention of getting involved in events, but something goes wrong. And then they have to step in and make sure that history happens the way that history is remembered.
Yeah, and obviously they all know about Captain Kirk and the Enterprise, so they really sort of like, they're celebrating all of the aspects of that as well in this episode. So they're excited, aren't they, to be back in that time period and be on that ship.
Yeah, particularly Dax. So this is when we get into her age being an interesting aspect of being a time traveler. She was mates with some of these Klingon characters that are in the episode. She remembers this time really vividly because it's just like 2 or 3 lifetimes, maybe just 2 lifetimes ago for her, or for her symbiote. And she's really nostalgic for it, and she really wants to meet Spock in particular, doesn't she?
Yeah. And she does imply that she got jiggy with McCoy, doesn't she?
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. I really like that. Dax is such a great character, and she's so fun in this episode. It's a really great episode for her being that Trill character with the past lives. She gets a lot of great plots like that, and this is a fun way of doing it. But what I did quite like was that she's starstruck by Spock, and she thinks Spock is super cool, and Sisko misunderstands. He thinks that she meant Kirk, and she had sex with McCoy and not Kirk.
He's got surgeon's hands.
Yeah. I quite like that because I think the franchise as a whole, and this episode in particular, just really, really can't get over how cool Captain Kirk is, and is just obsessed with Captain Kirk, which is fine, and it's an anniversary episode, but it's nice that she's actually cooing over Spock and had sex with McCoy, and they subvert that coolness of Kirk a little bit by celebrating the other characters.
Yeah. And like O'Brien has a fun time of it as well in terms of Kirk, because he doesn't really know what Kirk looks like. Yeah. So in one of the scenes, he says, "Oh yeah, it's Captain Kirk over there." It's just a completely random Starfleet officer who's just in the scene with Chekhov. And is it Scotty in that scene?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he's just in the background. He keeps going, "It's amazing how Kirk doesn't respond, even though they're taking the piss out of him."
Yeah. Yeah, I liked all that because I think overall this episode is really like celebrating Kirk and those characters. But those little kind of jokes at Kirk's expense, or rather Kirk's legacy's expense, that he's not as heroic and beloved in everyone's eyes, they reverse all of that at the very end by having like a scene where Sisko has to go back and deliver a report and just say how proud he is to have served with Captain Kirk. They have to like end on that point, which really annoyed me because it's so like, I don't know, it was just really cringy, that bit at the end.
I liked all the other bits. Like, it's so Back to the Future, isn't it? Because you've seen the Tribbles episode, you know how that goes. You're kind of expecting all the big moments and you're seeing them from slightly different angles. And it's just all of the fun that they have with that. And just like right down to the costumes that they're wearing, the nostalgia aspect of that, the fact that they can't get the lifts to work because none of them know how that technology works. And the predestination paradox crops up again, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. On the lift, are you talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love those lift scenes. It's Bashir, isn't it? Bashir just like has a mild panic attack and convinces himself he needs to go and find his great-grandmother and have sex with her.
Yeah, it's so random because like he keeps seeing that girl in the lift and he's obviously attracted to her, and then because of the time period of that Star Trek, it's kind of like, when would it have been done? Like the 60s? Yeah, so it's kind of like free love kind of vibe, and she is definitely making the moves on him. And then the moment when he's like, "Oh, I have to have sex with her in order to make sure that I'm born," and he just has that complete crisis in his head, is just absolutely gold.
It's a really funny scene. I love the way that his like inner narrative is just blurting out of his mouth and spiraling out of control, that he just hears her surname and he's immediately like, "Oh, that was my great-grandmother's surname. Oh no, is that my great-grandmother? Oh no, does that mean I'm my great-grandfather and I have to go and like ensure that I'm born?" Like, it's such a rapid spiral that plays on like time travel tropes that we've seen, and just makes a very quick joke out of it, and it's really good. It's got that lovely little scene for Bashir.
This could be a predestination paradox. Come on, Chief, surely you took elementary temporal mechanics at the Academy. I could be destined to fall in love with that woman and become my own great-grandfather.
You're being ridiculous.
Ridiculous? If I don't meet with her tomorrow, I may never be born.
Chief, are you ready for transport?
Are we ever?
Stand by.
You saw the way she looked at me. You can't just dismiss this.
I can try.
All right, fine.
Yeah, they slot quite a few of those little gags in, and they also add in quite a lot of stuff that's just there for the fans, you know, because it is an anniversary episode. And a lot of it is done through the special effects, which is just placing the characters in the scene. But there's some other stuff as well. Like, did you notice the storage compartments line?
Which bit?
So there's this amazing scene in the original series Tribbles episode where Kirk is having the situation explained to him on the station by the station officials, and he doesn't want to be there. Like you said, he's not interested. And they're like, I need you to guard my storage compartments. And Shatner just goes, storage compartments? Like, for no real reason. It doesn't make sense. His delivery in the scene is just incredibly strange. There's a moment in Trials and Tribulations where Sisko and Dax are sitting like in the mess hall or something, eavesdropping, and they hear something about some storage compartments, and Sisko goes, storage compartments? Storage compartments?
I want all available security guards. I want them posted around the storage compartments.
Storage compartments.
And in the storage compartments.
Storage compartments. Storage compartments.
And like, you know, that really made me laugh, because it made me laugh so much when I first saw Shatner's delivery, because it was so weird. And I just thought that, I don't know, they must have been rewatching the original episode to write this. And they were like, that's mad, the way he said storage compartments. We have to put a little gag in about storage compartments and have a character say it twice.
Yeah, and like one of the bits which made me laugh as well is when they talk about the fact that there's so many people on board all the time, and they go, oh, they really packed them in these spaceships.
Yeah, but it just looks like an accurate recreation of a shot from the original series, doesn't it? They really did have a lot of extras, like God knows why. And by comparison, like the Next Generation has very quiet corridors, doesn't it? It's like you just have one or two people crossing. Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of those moments where they have the little gags. I can't remember all of them. Another one that really stood out to me was like when they first arrive on the ship. I think it's O'Brien and Bashir have to pretend to do a job on the ship, and someone asks Julian to do something, and he's like, I'm a doctor, not an engineer. So he's using that like the McCoy catchphrase, and they're having a bit of fun with that.
Yeah, there's so many bits which are just amazing in this episode. And again, it's all the celebratory aspects. But I really liked the shots they had where you could just see the characters which had traveled in time in the background, just very subtly. And then you got all these moments which you remember from the original Tribbles episode, but seeing them in the back just adds that extra bit of humor to it in some cases, because they might be smirking or they might be looking at that person. So like there's definitely one moment in the on the bridge when Kirk looks to Dax, and then Dax gives like a little smirk or something like that. It's just, it's really good.
Yeah, it's when he's like picking up the Tribbles and he's all exasperated with all the Tribbles on the bridge, and she's just like catches his eye and does a little like, oh God, I know Tribbles, face. It's very well done, isn't it? Like it's very well edited, and the special effects to place the actors in the old footage is like really well done. I mean, it was really interesting that you said they got the idea from Forrest Gump, but you know, an episode of Deep Space Nine is not going to have the budget that Forrest Gump would have had to make those shots look good. So I think they've done a really good job here.
Yeah, definitely. And it's telling just like how much effort they put into it as well, because it's a very slick script, and it's just very, very well structured as well.
Yeah, like I said, I think it seems like a weird choice for an episode, but the way it's written is perfect. It's a perfect little time travel adventure into a non-serious episode to create a fun time travel episode. So it works perfectly, and it's perfect for an anniversary episode.
Yeah, and you got to see all the Tribbles again. Who doesn't love Tribbles?
Yeah.
Well, Klingons don't love them, but
Worf doesn't like Tribbles.
Oh, the Worf thing as well. So when he completely just glosses over the fact that Klingons look completely different in the original series.
Oh my God, yeah, I can't believe we almost didn't talk about that, James. It's so good, isn't it? What's the explanation? What does he say? He just says he doesn't want to talk about it.
He says something like, it's something we don't tell outsiders or something. And they all speculate. They go, oh, is it some sort of genetic thing or something like that? Like, what the hell happened to you guys? It's just, I love that they just don't give you an explanation. They're like, this is just what happened. Just accept it.
So their speculations, I think those are true. I haven't watched all of Enterprise, but I think Enterprise might get into giving an explanation for it. I don't know how in depth they go into it, but it is some sort of like genetic thing or like a plague that lasts but only lasts for like a generation or like 100 years or something like that. They do go into that and give an explanation, but I prefer Worf's explanation, which is like, it's just a thing and I don't want to talk about it.
They are Klingons, and it is a long story.
What happened? Some kind of genetic engineering?
A viral mutation?
We do not discuss it with outsiders.
So in each case, you're seeing the alien races having to sort of like hide their alienness, if that's a proper word. So they're always having to cover up and sort of like blend in. And the blending in's really cool as well.
Yeah, and the blending in is essential to making this episode work, blending them into the right time era and having them just lurking in the background. I noticed that Odo could just like hang out with people in the past and it wasn't an issue. I assumed that the reason that he didn't join Kira and O'Brien in past tense was that he would look strange in 2024. But I suppose they're just going back to Star Trek era, and you know, someone looking like an alien, looking a bit odd, is not out of place. But there shouldn't be any changelings in that time.
Yeah, and they do sort of like make a point of being of saying it's a big space station, don't they? And it's like there's lots of people on shore leave from whatever spaceship they're on at the time. So yeah, so they can kind of get away with it like that.
So yeah, I thought it was quite interesting that this episode and the other stories that we've looked at, they all follow the same kind of line, which is that there's an accidental or unwitting time travel and then they have to intervene, but they only intervene to protect the timeline. That feels like the kind of a real core aspect to time travel in Star Trek, because a lot of episodes do play out that way. But then because it's Star Trek, it's a great universe. You get to flesh it out with stuff like the guidelines and regulations and the Temporal Agency. I think the Temporal Agency comes back in like later Voyager, I think. They get in trouble with them and they've got some stories there. I'd like to see them explored in, you know, more Star Trek episodes if we ever get back to stuff like that and not prequel stuff that doesn't make any sense. Sorry. Yeah, did you enjoy seeing these Star Trek stories in the Star Trek franchise, James?
Yeah, I really enjoyed all of these episodes, and it's like you said before, it's interesting seeing how Star Trek's been able to approach it and how they've sort of like kept it. They've kept it going throughout each of these episodes, and they've sort of like set up their own rules about how they treat time travel. So they're sort of like very careful about the things they do, and again, they know science fiction. They know sort of like what sci-fi fans want in a time travel episode. So they've really sort of like lent into all of that kind of stuff over these episodes we've looked at. And I'm sure they do in the other episodes, which feature time travel.
Yeah, and they get to also have a little bit of fun with those rules in order to create a celebratory episode like Trials and Tribulations.
And speaking of celebratory episodes, next week it is our conclusion episode of our time travel series. So we will be celebrating all of the films we've looked at, and we will be running down the awards for various different categories. So it's going to be an exciting one.
Yes, all good things must come to an end. We are going to pop a bottle of champagne, drink it, and then turn time back so it's full again, and then drink it again, and then just keep doing that and have a great old time. So please do join us for that next time on the show. In the meantime, though, if you want to get in touch with us, please come and find us on Facebook on our discussion group and leave us a message there, or talk to other listeners of the show. You can email us at journeythroughsci-fi@gmail.com. Where can people find us on social media, James?
You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We're at Through Sci-Fi or at Through Sci-Fi Pod. We've also got a Facebook discussion group. You can come and join and talk to other fans of the show. We'd love to see you there. And if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, whatever your podcast server, it'd be great if you could leave us a review, a comment. It always helps with those pesky algorithms to help sort of like get more listeners on the show. So please do that. We'd really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for listening, and join us next time for the conclusion of Series 3 of Journey Through Sci-Fi.